Welcome to this webinar on behalf of the Federal Public Service Employment, Labour and Social Dialogue. It has become somewhat of a tradition that we present the English version of our biannual report in this way and to use the opportunity to relate it to the work and insight of others. We did this with the previous editions that were focused on people with a foreign origin on the labor market, and also now with a first edition that is focused on the broader diversity in the Belgian labor market. So the first starting point for the report is that we want to fully map the Belgian labor market in all its diversity, look at all the criteria that the anti-discrimination law lists as possible sources of discrimination. And then the second basic principle is that we use the administrative data that are available in Belgium, most in particular those that are brought together in the data warehouse, labor market and social protection of the Crossroads Bank for Social Security. This invaluable and for many reasons still somewhat underutilized data source allows for detailed mapping of the labor market and for a longitudinal follow-up. So during this webinar, first, Dr. Anne Koenen, expert in our ministry and one of the co-authors of the report, will present its main results, focusing on the highlights and on the new concepts that we have introduced. Now, throughout the years, our work on diversity has also allowed to invest in creating new concepts and bringing in new variables in this data source to further enrich it. Administrative data inevitably also have limits. They will never be able to capture everything, in particular not data that are dependent on self-declared statuses. But what we can do, however, more than compensates what we cannot do, and further improvements to further additions are under development. And one of these will be presented by Julie Maas. Dr. Julie Maas is a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Sociology at the University of Antwerp, specifically at the Center for Population, Family and Health. Her research focuses on topics such as the position of women with a migrant background in the labor market, the impact of parenthood, and the use of childcare. And today she will present the results of a study that she conducted on behalf of our ministry, together with Jonas Wood, Carol Nails, and Sundicha Vucic, with the aim to enrich further reports. And then after Julie's presentation, we will look beyond our borders to put our results in an international perspective. A more diverse labor market is a necessity for many reasons, one of them being that it will be an essential contribution to tackling the demographic challenges that we are facing. So Professor Aris Alexopoulos has been head of the OECD Crete Center on Population Dynamics since its foundation in 2024. The center's work primarily focuses on analyzing and providing policy recommendations in the areas of population dynamics, aging, fertility, population movements, migration, diaspora, and so on. Aris is also professor of public policy analysis, and so he's excellently suited to guide the center in its mission to provide policy recommendations. Then finally, we will give the floor to Monica Schaba, who is policy officer in the European Commission's DG Employment. And she's an expert on disability and inclusion and coordinates the work on the disability employment package. And previously, she has also worked on active inclusion. So as you will see, bringing people with disabilities back into our labor market is a daunting challenge for Belgium, and putting it in an EU perspective can only help us. So with that, I will now hand over to Anne to present the main results of the report to us.
Thank you, Tom. So this morning, as Tom said, I would like to first guide you through the main points of our report, which has 400 pages and is accompanied by almost as many appendices containing detailed data. So I cannot tell you everything here, but I will try to outline some of the striking findings and hopefully pique your curiosity about the rest. As said, the report discusses the situation in Belgium, but we believe that it is useful for policymakers and researchers outside of our countries as well. And maybe even more importantly, we wanted to again have this chance to exchange with experts from outside Belgium to give us additional recommendation from a bird's eye view. So also for those of you who were already familiar with the report in its Dutch and its French versions, I think you will also gain some new insights here. So very briefly on the methodology, Tom has already said that the data that we use mainly comes from the Labour Market and Social Protection Data Warehouse of the Crossroads Bank for Social Security. That means it contains anonymous administrative data on all persons known to the Belgian social security institutions, which actually covers virtually the entire population aged 18 to 64. And the wealth of data that is available and that can be coupled this way is, of course, a huge advantage for socioeconomic research, but it does take a lot of time to integrate everything. And the disadvantage of this is that at the time of writing, we only had complete data from all institutions up to 2021. So we are mainly looking at the period from 2011 to 2021. On the one hand, we look at variables that are already present in the data warehouse, some of which we helped develop in the past. And on the other hand, we have created new variables combining available data sources. And I will come back to those later on. So our report contains a number of chapters on traditional labor market indicators, such as employment, inactivity, the unemployment rate. It looks at the differences between sectors, between wage levels, part-time and full-time work. But in all of these chapters, we try to look at the differences between origin groups, age groups, gender, and other explanatory variables, such as the family situation of persons, the level of education, their field of study. And we try to go into as much detail as we can. In addition, we have analyzed 3 themes separately, which were previously absent from the monitoring instruments that we have. The first one is the impact of having a disability. Secondly, there are 2 chapters on the situation of the long-term sick. And thirdly, the influence of sexual orientation. So just some highlights from the report. As said, in the first chapter, which is quite a classical chapter, we have a breakdown of the population in Belgium of working age by sex, age, and all the other available characteristics. This is, of course, necessary context to interpret the situation on the labor market in the other chapters. So it's quite classic, but it also contains some interesting findings. For example, what you see here, are some noteworthy differences in the level of education of different origin groups that are present in our country. We can also look at how they differ in average age, in migration background, the fields of study that they have, and the same goes for women and age groups. So we really can go in depth into the composition of the population, and that allows us to explain some of the differences on the labor market afterwards. So in chapter 2, we look at the socioeconomic position of different groups on our labor market. Generally, in this chapter, we see that there has been an improvement in the employment rate among 20-64-year-olds, and that the unemployment rate for 18 to 64-year-olds has went down over the decade study. However, we also clearly see that there are significant differences between various subgroups. And these differences have barely decreased, pointing to a structurally highly segmented labor market. The chapter clearly points to ongoing challenges for low-skilled persons, for people with a non-EU background, for those over 55, even though we have seen an improvement here. And what we also know and see in our data is that there is very limited professional mobility, both between sectors and geographically, which is even worsening with age, which of course further segments the segmentation that we find. So if we look very generally at employment rates, as said, we see some improvements over time among all the groups that we can identify, but these improvements are still far from enough to actually close the gaps with the best performers. And when we go even deeper and cross some of the different characteristics, for example, gender and origins, we see even larger differences between, for example, women of Belgian origin and women with an origin from outside the EU. We also see that, for example, for those over 55, also women aged 55 and over, that there is a very clear improvement in their employment rate, but they are still far behind the best performers. And I am sure that Mr. Alexopoulos will later on have more to say on these particular challenges. Now, if we then look at the inactivity rate, we see similar improvements. The inactivity rate has fallen, but it remains unmistakably high in Belgium in general, and it certainly is very high for the low-skilled, for women with a migration background, and for those over 55. This is not a big surprise, I think, for most of you. But then in chapter 3, we look closer at two aspects of job quality, namely the wage level and part-time work. And we look mainly at the different distribution according to all of the available characteristics that we have. So this chapter, of course, only looks at those people that are in employment, that have found a way to enter our labor market. But again, it shows some clear signs of the segmentation within the world of work itself. So first of all, even though we know that Belgium in international perspective has a relatively small gender pay gap, we see clear differences between men and women. Overall, we see that women have a slightly lower share of employees in the high wage category. These are the 3 highest wage deciles, and a higher share in the lowest deciles. And when we add age to this, the difference becomes even more pronounced, which is probably related to the fact that women have shorter careers, they work less hours on average, they have more career breaks, which means that they can benefit less from the wage premium that is generally linked to seniority or tenure. And this becomes especially pronounced when we also add the level of education. While men with a lower level of education are still often found in jobs in relatively well-paid professions, women without a degree often end up in the worst paid jobs, such as cleaning, for instance. And there is also very clearly a difference in the distribution by origin group, with persons of non-EU origin, which, for the record, includes children of migrants, so also the second generation, having a much higher share of low wages. Higher education can make up for this to some extent, but we see that the higher education premium is clearly much lower for those from outside the EU than it is for Belgians. Then in the 4th chapter, we have a look at the sectoral decomposition of the labor market, because of course there are large differences between sectors of economic activity. And on this slide, what you can see is the net evolution of employment per sector and also by origin. And it's important to note that total employment has grown for all origins between 2012 and 2021. But there are some major differences again in the dynamics between different sectors. For example, it's clear that employment in industry has declined most sharply. And it is actually particularly workers of Belgian origins and also those from the oldest EU member states who have disappeared from this sector. In construction, trade and transport, on the other hand, which are sectors which have a relatively large share of lower wages, workers of Belgian origin also disappeared. The cause of this may be retirement, job mobility, or collective layoffs. So they could have moved to other sectors, or they may have left the labor market entirely. Now, we also know from the same data by level of education that it was mainly the jobs for people with at most a lower secondary education certificate, so the low-skilled, that have disappeared, while jobs for other levels of education have been increasing in our country. So that means that while a positive net evolution in employment applies to all origins, we see a net decrease in the employment of people who completed lower secondary education at most, certainly also among those of Belgian origin. For other origins, the number of jobs filled by low-skilled has still slightly increased, but to a much lesser extent than those with medium or high-skilled backgrounds. So there is an improvement, as said, which explains also the improvement in the employment rate, but not all groups are benefiting from this to the same extent. The public sector merits a closer look because it accounts for just over a fifth of all employees in Belgium. And for female employees, it's more than a quarter, actually. However, here we see that people of Belgian origin are still much more likely to be employed in the public sector than those of foreign origin. The situation does seem to become more balanced over time, especially for people from non-EU countries. But we also see that public sector employees are mainly statutory civil servants with an open-end contract or, well, a statute. And this general observation does apply mainly to those of Belgian origins, while others from foreign origins mainly work as contractual blue or white collar workers. So we see that there are some improvements in the public sector, which is the largest employer in this country, but it is not yet sufficient to really set an example in terms of inclusion and equality among those present in the sector. Then we go to the chapters that contain our innovations, let's say, and the first one is the 5th chapter. In that chapter, we have examined the place of people with disabilities in the population, of which we will talk about more later on with Ms. Chaba from DG Employment. Now, we want to look particularly at their labor market status, of course, see whether they are employed or not, but also the sector in which they then work, the type of employment contract they have. And before I do that, I will not say much about the methodology that has been developed, but because it was quite complex, a lot of sources were used, and the report describes all of this in detail. But I do want to point out that when we talk about persons with a disability in the context of this chapter, it means that those without a disability are those who have never applied for recognition of their disability for whatever reason. It does not necessarily mean that they don't have any disability. So it is clearly an administrative concept here, which of course has some disadvantages. Now, when using the definition that we have within the administrative data, we see that people with recognized disabilities represent only 4.2% of the total population between 18 and 64 in 2021. With about 2.6% of them receiving a benefit due to their disability and 1.6% not receiving benefits. Now, certain categories of people are clearly overrepresented within the group of persons with a disability. And the first thing that is clear is that the proportion of people with recognized disabilities increases with age, with a significant acceleration from the age of 40 onwards, and also that this affects women more strongly, but also, to a slighter extent, people of foreign origin. Particularly people with origins in Maghreb countries, in Eastern European countries, or in EU candidate countries, which are the countries with the longest migration history to our country. They have seen the strongest growth in the number of people receiving benefits since 2011, which now makes their share greater than those of Belgian origin. Now, what is mainly of interest, as said, is their labor market outcomes. So on this slide, we look at their employment, unemployment, and inactivity rate, and we see that clearly people with recognized disabilities who receive a benefit have the lowest employment rate, less than 20%. And it is even lower for women, for younger and older people, from people with origins in North Africa, in other Eastern countries, and in the Near Middle East. These same groups also have an employment rate that is approximately 3 times higher than those without benefits or without recognized benefits, as said. But the unemployment rate has been declining. Persons with recognized disabilities who receive benefits also have the highest inactivity rate, almost 80%. And the gap in employment rates between people with recognized disabilities and those without has even widened since 2011, but also mainly due to the increase in the employment rate of those without disabilities. So it's mainly that the disadvantage of those with a disability has been growing due to smaller progress. Now, we can look at the small group that is employed. And among those with a disability that are employed, there are again differences in the job characteristics. For example, only about 55% of people with disabilities work full-time, compared to over 60% of the population without disabilities. The proportion of people working very short part-time hours, which is less than 46% of full-time hours, and those working half-time, is also higher among people with recognized disabilities who receive benefits. So those that are employed tend to work a bit less on average. Then I want to highlight some things from the chapters 6 and 7. Now, one of the major challenges facing our labor market over the last couple of decades is a large number of people who are unable to work due to sickness. And that is why our report contained 2 chapters focusing on incapacity for work and long-term illness. In the first chapter, chapter 6, we analyzed people who are only covered by incapacity for work or invalidity insurance and who therefore no longer have an employment contract, nor are they registered as job seekers. In the second chapter, we will look at a much larger group of people who have been ill for at least 6 months, but who are still registered in other categories as well. So first, what I can immediately say is that both chapters show that the situation is nothing short of dramatic. The number and the proportion of long-term sick people has been increasing in all of the subgroups that we can distinguish, and the duration of those sickness absences has been increasing. However, although this is a problem that affects the entire Belgian labor market, we again note that there are differences between groups. Women and also persons of candidate EU and Maghreb origin have significantly higher and also more rapidly growing numbers of long-term sick persons. And the proportion of persons unable to work also increases significantly with age, as you can see on the slide. Now, some origin groups, on the other hand, have relatively low proportions of long-term sick people, much lower than those of Belgian origins. But here we see that these are mainly the groups that contain more recent newcomers, people who have recently moved to our country and who might simply not have access yet to this particular benefit system. So that is, I think the shares are already quite worrying, but on this slide it becomes even more worrying because we look at trajectories before and after incapacity for work. And this graph only shows the proportion of people who are working a year later. So this includes all people who were incapacitated for work in the previous year, including those who may have already been incapacitated for more than a year. And we see that very few of them are moving to work after incapacity. And actually the proportion of people who just remain incapacitated for work or who are again incapacitated for work 1 year later is above 80% in almost all subgroups. Even 3 years later than the reference year, it remains at 70% of people who just remain in long-term sickness. Only people younger than 34 do a little bit better, as you can see on the slide here. A little over 1/3 move to employment again. But in particular, people with low levels of education and those over 55 very rarely find their way back into the labor market, which means that incapacity for work is clearly very persistent. And there seems to have been a trade-off with other early retirement schemes, with the outflow out of incapacity only increasing when people go to retirement. I want to point out again that in this chapter, we are looking only at those people who are solely registered as incapacitated for work. So their results are a little bit worse than those who still have some ties to the labor market. So here we see a slide that also shows some of the scarring effects that might occur, which is very important because not only do people remain for a very long time in incapacity to work, they also risk having some scarring effects when they return to work. So if we compare in the chapter their working regime, but also the wage level and the sector before and after incapacity, we observe, first of all, a very negative effect on wages, which is quite long-term. What is probably due to the fact that they can accumulate less seniority as a result of the break in the career, but also because they might end up in a new job with somewhat less favorable wage conditions. And we also see on this slide that the proportion of full-time workers declines after incapacity for work. The decline is actually the biggest among people with a higher education degree, but this is also due to the fact that these groups have the highest proportion of full-time work in general, so also before. So these are probably also the workers who have more space to reduce their working hours when they return to work. And we should also ask ourselves whether people in low levels of education and people of foreign origin can make the same choice, or whether their financial situation maybe forces them to continue to work full-time, even when returning after sickness. As said in chapter 7, we look at a broader group of people in long-term incapacity for work who might still be registered under an employment contract or another socioeconomic status. And I can briefly say that in general, the results are quite similar, even though this group does a little bit better. But what I would like to point out as an extra finding here is that there are also notable differences between different family situations. So as said, the increase in long-term incapacity for work is more pronounced for women in general, but particularly for single women with children and women in couples. Women with children are even more exposed to prolonged absences as well, so long periods of sickness, because the interference between work and family responsibilities increases their risk of long-term incapacity. Because this chapter includes persons who are still linked to an employer, it means we can also have a look at the sectors where they are employed. And the data reveals that there is a very strong increase in most sectors, but it is clear that the health sector has a very high proportion of long-term ill, and so do the administrative services, which also shows a very significant increase. And this is, of course, explained by the nature of the jobs, which can be more physically straining, the working conditions with more flexible hours, but also the demographic composition of those sectors. So that brings us finally to chapter 8 of our report, which presents the last innovation. Now, here we take a look at sexual orientation, but this is information that is protected by the anti-discrimination law, and which is not covered by any comprehensive statistics. So in order to be able to assess the possible impact, we have created a proxy based on data from the National Register relating to legal cohabitation and marriage. That means that in this chapter, we only look at the situation of people who have a partner with whom they are married or legally cohabitating, and not at single people. So furthermore, we can only look at whether the partner they live with is of the same or a different sex, according to the binary administrative classification. So we do not know anything about people who have a different sexual orientation or a different gender. Now, people living in such a same-sex couple make up only a small proportion of the population aged 20 to 64, only about 0.5%. So there is clearly still a large group absent from this data. Meanwhile, almost half of the population is living officially with a partner of the opposite sex. And before examining the labor market situation, it's useful to gain some understanding in the characteristics of the groups that we identified with this method. I will not discuss age because I'm already taking up too much time, but the data on age indicates that there is an underrepresentation, which makes sense, of 20 to 24-year-olds among married or cohabitating persons, because they are still often living at home. In the group from 25 to 34, we see that there is an overrepresentation of legally cohabitating couples. And then in older groups, this moves to a larger part of married couples. The 35 to 44 age group has the largest proportion of same-sex couples. Also interesting is that the level of education data shows that those in same-sex couples and in legally cohabitating opposite-sex couples tend to be higher educated than the other groups. And lastly, when we look at origin, we see that there's a slight overrepresentation of persons in same-sex couples among the Belgian origin, and also an underrepresentation of same-sex couples from non-EU countries. Again, these are individuals who actually live together as a couple. So many people might have a different sexual orientation, but remain absent from this data. Now, when we look at the labor market, we see that the employment rate of legally cohabitating couples, both same-sex and opposite-sex, is higher than that of married couples. And this applies to all genders, regions, levels of education, and origins. However, while the employment rate of married women in same-sex couples is much higher than that of married heterosexual women, the opposite is true for men. And this suggests that the pressure of traditional gender roles may be higher in heterosexual couples. It is also interesting to note that the employment rate of women in same-sex couples is higher than that of male same-sex couples and that of married heterosexual men. So the differences between these family types and these genders can be explained by various factors. One of them being that women in same-sex couples generally have higher level of educations, which increases their employability, but also that women in same-sex relationships also appear to be less constrained by traditional family roles. And furthermore, that young heterosexual women seem to experience more recruitment discrimination, as they are perceived more likely to have children, to take on more domestic responsibilities. Women in a relationship with a person of the opposite sex are also more likely to work in sectors that are predominantly female and less socially valued, which is not the case for women in same-sex couples. Men in same-sex couples also seem to face specific discrimination, giving them fewer opportunities compared to women in same-sex couples. So to sum up, this chapter not only highlights the effects of sexual orientation, but it also provides insights into the combined impact of gender, age, level of education, and of family situation. I don't have time to go into the distribution by sector, so I invite you to take a look at this chapter because the different overrepresentation of homosexual and heterosexual women and men in sectors also points to a couple of ways that people in same-sex couples partly seem to escape classic gender differences between sectors, but also that they may have poorer access to some sectors, maybe due to discrimination or other factors. So some very general conclusions. There is much more in the report and much more work for future research as well. But what we see is that there are large differences on our labor market between all types of group. Our labor market is segmented and we are making limited progress in improving that segmentation. We also see that in many cases, different factors reinforce each other's and that the same groups tend to end up in different types of vulnerable situation, either staying outside of the labor market, but also when they are employed. And so that means that different labor market outcomes do not only occur when people enter the labor market, but that they also translate in growing differences throughout the careers. And I will now give the floor back to Tom to announce our other speakers.
Thank you very much. We will have time for questions later, but we will first go to the next presentation. Indeed, all different factors related to diversity and to labor market over underrepresentation interact, and therefore we have asked the University of Antwerp to map this for us and to look at the decomposition. And so for that, I will hand over to Julie Maas. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Julie Maas from the University of Antwerp. And as Anne and Tom already said, we know that some groups show lower employment levels compared to other groups. And the literature indicates that such differences arise from multiple mechanisms, but also that part of the variation in labor market outcomes is related to differences in the profiles of groups. But in the Belgian context, there is little research that systematically examines which of these differences between groups remain once we control for such profile characteristics. So therefore, in this study, we focus on 5 dimensions of population heterogeneity, being gender, age, educational level, origin, and disability. And we use decomposition analysis to assess to what extent differences in employment rates between groups remain once we control for a broad set of individual and household level profile characteristics. And today in this presentation, I want to discuss the methodology that we used in detail. And then I want to show a selection of the results just to illustrate some findings of the decomposition analysis for some groups, because we have a very, very elaborate report. And if you're interested in the results, I recommend you to have a look at all the figures and tables that are presented there. And then I want to end the presentation with some of our main take-home messages and some recommendations for future research. I also want to assess that we use the same data source as Anne already talked about, so administrative data, which allows us to perform longitudinal analysis of people living in Belgium. So as I said, we use decomposition methods to analyze differences in employment rates between two groups. And I want to illustrate this methodology by using the difference in employment rate between men and women. So the starting point of our analysis is the observed difference in the employment rate of men and women. And using decomposition methods, we divide this observed difference between two groups, in this example, men and women, in two parts. On the one hand, a profile component, and on the other hand, an association component. And if we put this in an equation, it looks like this, and I'll walk you through it. So on the left-hand side of the equation, we have the observed difference between the mean employment rate of men and the mean employment rate of women. And then on the right-hand side, we first have the profile component, which is the part of the employment gap that can be attributed to differences in observed profile characteristics between the groups. So this is the extent to which the difference in employment between men and women is related to the different profiles of men and women. And then we also have the association component, which is the part that is due to the different associations between these profile characteristics and employment. So this is the part of the employment gap that remains once we correct for differences between men and women in the observed profile characteristics. But if we quantify these profile components between men and women, this depends on which associations between profile characteristics and employment that we use. So in the first equation, we estimate the profile components by using the associations between profile characteristics and employment as we observe among women. While in the second equation, the profile component is estimated by using the associations between characteristics and employment as observed among men. And the choice of this reference point has important implications for the interpretation of our results, because the association between profile characteristics and employment might differ between subgroups. For example, the association between level of education and employment might differ between men and women. So this means that also the size of the difference that remains after controlling for profile characteristics may vary depending on which associations we use, those of women or those of men. So in this study, we illustrate both perspectives. So first, we address the difference in employment after controlling for profile characteristics using the associations of the group with the lowest employment rates. So in this example, women. And this indicates the extent to which the employment of women changes when women are assigned the same profile as men, but assuming that the associations between these characteristics and employment still reflect the associations as we observe among women. And then we use the associations of the group with the highest employment rates, in this example, men, as shown in equation 2. And this allows us to assess which differences remain after controlling for the different profiles of men and women, assuming that these characteristics have the same association with employment as is the case for men. And there are also two important methodological notes I want to highlight. So first, while decomposition analysis show to which extent observed differences in employment are related to different profile characteristics, they cannot identify whether these different profile characteristics actually cause the gap which we observe. And then second, I also want to emphasize the potential endogeneity of some profile characteristics. So some of the characteristics that are included in the analysis are largely fixed from birth, such as gender and origin, and can be considered as exogenous. But there are also other characteristics such as educational level, field of study, or place of residence that may be partly endogenous, because they may be partly influenced by other factors that also influence later labor market positions, such as motivation or other personal traits. And in the analysis, we also included household position and the number of children in the household, which are aspects that vary over the life course and might also be influenced by later labor market positions and prospects. So I really want to highlight this, as is important when interpreting the results. So in this study, we look at 5 dimensions of population heterogeneity. And within each of these dimensions, the group with the highest employment rate is considered as the reference group. And we also perform all analysis separately for men and women. So the first dimension is gender, and here we compare employment rate of men with those of women. Then we look at the dimension of age, and here we consider the group 30 to 54 as the reference group, and we compare this group with individuals who are younger than 30 and individuals aged 55 to 65. Then we look at differences by educational level, and individuals with a high level of education are considered as a reference group. Then we have origin differences, and here we compare the Belgian origin group to 11 foreign origin groups. And then finally, we use the same indicator for disability status as Anne talked about, and we compare individuals without a disability to individuals with a recognized disability who are receiving benefits, individuals with a recognized disability without benefits, and also individuals with an unrecognized disability. And these dimensions that are central in the study are also used as profile characteristics. So we estimate 2 models. In the first model, we look at the employment gap after controlling for individual profile characteristics, which are age, educational level, field of study, place of residence, origin, and disability status. So when we look at the dimension of educational level and we compare, for example, low with high educated individuals, we do not additionally control for level of education, but we do control for age, field of study, place of residence, origin, and disability status. And the same goes for the other dimensions. So in the first model, we control for individual level profile characteristics. And in the second model, we additionally control for household position and number of children in the household. So now I want to show you some of the results. I will highlight some differences between groups, but as said, there are a lot of figures, and I want to just highlight some of the results to show how these results look like. So first, I want to show you some results on differences by level of education. And this figure clearly shows that highly educated individuals show the highest employment rates, being 85% for men and 82% for women, and that individuals with medium or low levels of education show systematically lower employment rates. So then we compare each of these educational groups with the highly educated group. And today I want to show you the results comparing low educated individuals with high educated individuals. So in this figure, the black bars show the observed employment gap between low and high educated individuals. And we see that this employment gap is 27 percentage points among men and 38 percentage points among women. So this is a starting point of our decomposition analysis. And then the light green bars show that when we correct for differences in profile between the low and highly educated groups in terms of age, origin group, field of study, place of residence, and disability status, the employment gap decreases substantially to 11 percentage points for men and to 17 percentage points for women when we use the associations between these characteristics and employment as observed among the low educated group themselves. Then if we look at the light blue bars, we see that when we use the associations as observed among the highly educated group, that the results are largely similar. So also when we use the associations of the highly educated group, the gap reduces to about 13 percentage points for men and to 19 percentage points for women. If we then additionally control for differences in household level characteristics in model 2, we see that there is almost no further shift in the employment gap between the low and highly educated group compared to model 1, both among men and among women. And this is the case when we use the associations as observed among the low educated group. So when we compare the light green with the dark green bar, but also when we use the associations that we observe among the highly educated group. So comparing the light blue with the dark blue bar. So this figure shows that these differences in profile characteristics actually account for part of the observed gap that we can see. And then we want to go a bit further and see which specific characteristics actually contribute to this reduction in the employment gap. And that's what you can see here. So this figure shows for men and women the contribution of each profile characteristics to the employment gap between low and high educated groups. And if we have a positive contribution, it means that the profile component in our equation increases. So in turn, the difference between low and highly educated individuals decreases after controlling for these characteristics. And this figure shows that all characteristics have a positive contribution. So we see that all profile characteristics contribute to the employment gap between the low and highly educated. So if we have a closer look, we see that low educated individuals are more often of foreign origin, more often have a disability, and also more often live in Wallonia and low-income municipalities in Brussels, which are all characteristics that are associated with lower employment. If we look at a field of study, we see that low-educated individuals more often have a degree in general qualifications or have an unspecified field of study, which is again associated with lower employment. And we also see that the low educated group has a smaller share of individuals aged 30 to 54, which is then again positively associated with employment. So when we control for these individual profile characteristics, we find that the profile component increases and the difference with the highly educated group decreases. Then we also see that differences between low and high educated individuals in terms of household position contribute to the employment gap, because liberal position also has a positive contribution to the employment gap. Because our results show that low educated individuals are less often cohabiting or married without children, which is positively associated with employment, and live more often with their parents, which is again negatively associated with employment. But you can clearly see in this figure that the contributions of the other characteristics change a bit between model 1 and model 2. So this means that there is almost no differences in the employment gap between model 1 and 2, as we saw in the previous figure, because this additional contribution of household position is compensated by lower contributions of the other profile characteristics. And then we also see that there is almost no contribution of the number of children present in the households. So this is a small example of the findings for differences by level of education. And then I also want to show some results on differences by origin group. So as Anne already told you, and as you can see here in this figure, there are strong differences in employment between origin groups, where men and women of Belgian origin have the highest employment rates of 76 and 72%, while the employment rates of foreign origin individuals are lower. And what we then do is compare each of these foreign origin groups with the Belgian origin group. And in the report, we also make a further distinction by generation and duration of residence for each of these origin groups. So a lot of figures, a lot of tables. So today I only want to show you the results of one origin group, but I also want to refer to some general patterns that we can observe across origin groups. So I chose the figure comparing employment between individuals of Maghreb and Belgian origin. And the black bars indicate that the observed difference is 16 percentage points among men and 33 percentage points among women. And when we correct in model 1 for differences in age, educational level, field of study, place of residence, and disability status, the light green bars show that the employment gap for men and women decreases substantially to 8 percentage points among men and to 16 percentage points for women when we use the associations between these characteristics and employment as observed among the Maghreb origin group themselves. And in the light blue bars show the results of model 1, but based on the associations between these individual profile characteristics and employment as we observe among the Belgian origin group. And we see that results are quite similar for men. So the light green bar and the light blue bar are relatively similar. But among women, we see that the reduction in the employment gap is more limited when we use the associations observed among the Belgian origin group. And actually, this is the case among most foreign origin groups. So among most groups, we see that the decline is generally larger when we base the decomposition analysis on the associations between characteristics and employment, as observed among the foreign origin group themselves, than when we use the associations of the Belgian origin group. And for most origin groups, we also find, as is the case among Maghreb men, that the additional correction for differences in household characteristics leads only to a limited further decline in the employment gap. But for women of Maghreb origin, we see that the employment gaps becomes additionally somewhat smaller when we control for household composition. And this is only observed as well among women of candidate EU countries and women of sub-Saharan African countries. So also only for these three groups, we find that an additional control for household level characteristics further reduces the employment gap. Let's have a look at the contribution of the specific profile characteristics. Actually, what we find for all origin groups is that disability status plays no or almost no role, as differences between origin groups are also limited in terms of disability status. And as we can see here, but which is the case for most groups, is that we find a negative contribution of age. So for many foreign origin groups, they show a relatively younger age structure, which is positively associated with employment. So this means that the employment gap with the Belgian origin groups increases when we control for these age differences. And this is kind of generally a general pattern across origin groups. And then for most origin groups, as we also see here for the Maghreb group, we find that place of residence, educational level, and field of study are the most important individual level profile characteristics. So we find that foreign origin groups more often live in large urban regions and municipalities in Brussels, where employment opportunities are lower. If we look at educational level, we see that the Belgian origin group has a higher share of highly educated individuals, which is associated with the highest employment chances, while many foreign origin groups have more lower educated individuals and also more often have an unknown educational level, which is also strongly associated with low employment chances. And looking at field of study, we see that non-Belgian groups more often have an unspecified field of study, which goes together with lower employment chances. So when we control for these differences, this entails a smaller employment gap with the Belgian origin group, as we saw in the previous figure. Then if we look at household level characteristics, we find for Maghreb men that the contribution of differences in household position and number of children is relatively limited, which, as I told, is also the case among most other origin groups. But for Maghreb women, we find that the employment gap with Belgian women decreases after controlling for the fact that women of Maghreb origin have on average more children in the household than Belgian women, which is negatively associated with the likelihood of employment. But you see a difference between the green and the blue bar, because this negative association is stronger for women of Maghreb origin than for women of Belgian origin. So this means that the positive contribution of this characteristic increases when we use the association as observed among the Maghreb group. So this is why the green bar is larger than the blue bar among Maghreb women. So this is only a small selection of the results, because I want to talk about some take-home messages and avenues for future research. So we have a couple of take-home messages. And the first is that differences in employment rates between population subgroups cannot be meaningfully interpreted without accounting for differences in the profiles of these groups. In the public debates, groups are often directly compared on the basis of a single dimension, but this can create the impression that the chosen dimension, such as origin, is also the main cause of lower employment. Whereas these differences may also stem from differences between groups in the composition of other relevant characteristics. So in this study, we really want to highlight that it is important to analyze labor market inequalities across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Then a second important conclusion is that even when we control for a broad set of individual and household level profile characteristics, substantial differences in employments between groups persist. And this means that gender, age, origin, educational level, and disability each remain relevant axes for understanding labor market inequalities in their own right. And this also implies that policies that are aimed at reducing labor market inequalities must pay attention to the specific barriers that these groups face. And then third insight is that not only the profile characteristics themselves matter, but also the extent to which these characteristics are associated with employment opportunities within each group. We find, for example, that the same level of education yields different returns in terms of employment among some foreign origin groups compared to the Belgian origin groups. So this means that policy strategies that focus exclusively on improving profile characteristics, such as raising educational attainment, may be insufficient if those characteristics do not translate into higher employment to the same extent. So from a policy perspective, this requires a dual approach. So on the one hand, improving the characteristics themselves, but on the other hand, also addressing the mechanisms that limits their returns for some groups, such as discrimination, unequal access to information or networks, or unequal access to childcare or mobility. And our findings also point to several avenues for future research. So first, we recommend to structurally embed analysis that correct for differences in profile characteristics into monitoring instruments, because this enables a systematic monitoring of developments in, on the one hand, the profiles of groups, but also on the extent to which profile characteristics are associated with employment. Then second, our decomposition analysis could be refined by using more detailed and richer data, but it remains essential to be cautious when we interpret the contribution of potentially endogenous characteristics and to explicitly acknowledge such limitations when we draw policy conclusions. Then a third research avenue is to systematically analyze differences between groups in the returns of specific characteristics for employment. And this is crucial for evaluating the effectiveness of policy interventions. Because, for example, if you look at training intervention, this will only fully pay off if a higher degree offers the same opportunities for all groups, which is, according to our results and the literature, unfortunately not always the case. And then finally, since the decomposition analyses that are used in this study do not allow to identify causal relationships, it would be beneficial to adopt causal identification strategies in future research, possibly in combination with decomposition or simulation models, to really better understand which characteristics cause differences in employment and to quantify to which extent they explain the employment gap at the group level. And I think that's within my 30 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Julie, for bringing the necessary nuance into the analysis and also into the policy debate. Let's look a bit beyond our borders and link what we find in Belgium to the international debate on demographics and also on disability. To start this, I will hand over to Aris Alexopoulos. Aris, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Tom. Many thanks to the organizers for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure to join you for the launch of the first Belgian diversity report of the FPS Employment, Labour and Social Dialogue, and to offer this international perspective on labour market diversity, drawing on the OECD's experience, especially through the lenses of population aging and demographics. First of all, some general comments on the report. The report is a notable deliverable which reflects the broader socioeconomic and cultural dynamics that shape Belgium's workforce, and at the same time it examines in depth diversity in the Belgian labour market, a key factor in boosting labour market participation, and introduces methodological innovations that have enabled a better mapping of the prevailing conditions. As mentioned in it, it has a dual role, being both a tool for the monitoring of the socioeconomic dimension of the labour market, as well as a policy design tool. Now, going through the report provides deep insights on the current situation regarding the labour market diversity, as well as the potential areas of improvement. So in my talk, I will try to elaborate on the importance of these findings in most OECD countries, and as well as on the increasingly pressing need to take the necessary decisions that will foster a more diverse labour market against the backdrop of rapidly aging populations. I will also try to bring forward why the labour market shortages could offer a window of opportunity to tackle disparities from which our societies suffer. So the emergence of new minority groups, such as the youth, in an increasingly aging population, will bring to the public discourse the debate on how we will safeguard minorities' rights. Population aging poses severe challenges to the sustainability of our societies and economies, and the emerging changes in the age distribution structure are expected to significantly affect living standards and threaten the gains achieved through the post-war growth model. According to recent OECD research, it leads to a decrease in the share of workers. In the population, which ceteris paribus would reduce per capita income across the OECD by nearly 8% over the next 3 decades, with some countries experiencing up to 20% shortfall. The mathematics behind this projection point point to potential strategies to mitigate the consequences of aging or adapt to it. Enhancing productivity is one of them. Increasing participation and employment rates can play a pivotal role, as Matt shows. The report is very informative on the current situation regarding labour market participation in Belgium, its improvement over the recent years, and as well the distance that needs to be covered to reach the desired goals. It turns out that in recent years, the Belgian labour market has shown strong performance, and this progress was not halted by the unprecedented shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. The employment rate of those aged between 20 and 64 rose from 65.7% in 2011 to 70.2% in 2021. As mentioned in the report, this is far from the sensible target that has been set to reach by 2030, 80% of the Belgian population aged between 20 and 64 should be in employment. The situation, though, is similar for most OECD countries. The employment rate for the 15-64 age group was 70.2% in 2024 across the OECD area. At the same time, labour markets suffer from the fact that there are many unfilled vacancies. For example, recent research that we performed in the Crete Center demonstrated that the number of vacancies per unemployment, which is a measure of tightness for the labour market, has increased in some countries. The employer survey of the OECD Global Forum on Productivity, conducted at the firm level for the period 2022-2023 and covering approximately 500 to 1,000 firms per country, highlights this phenomenon. It revealed that about 80% of business in OECD countries face difficulties in finding human resources, with 1/4 of firms reporting these difficulties as particularly severe. In certain sectors, such as health, information and communication technologies, construction and industry, shortages are even more pronounced. Low employment rates combined with tightness in the labour market make it essential to examine diversity in labour markets. When large groups are unprecedented or face barriers to access the labour market, economies fail to make full use of available talent. Understanding differences in employment outcomes by dimensions as gender, age, origin, disability, or education helps identify where obstacles persist and which groups are being left behind. The first Belgian diversity report provides, among others, statistical information regarding key employment indicators broken down by a wide range of different variables, such as sex, origin, level of education, age, region, family situation, industrial sectors, disability status, and type of inactivity. Such variables contain much information that sheds light on the level of diversity that characterizes the labour market. In line with these variables, the OECD report, All Hands In, Making Diversity Work for All, focuses on 5 overlapping groups that are widely seen as being disadvantaged and discriminated against in the labour market, namely women, immigrants, their descendants, and ethnic minorities, LGBT people, older people, and people with disabilities. Of course, the choice of groups to include is challenging. Young people, for example, are disadvantaged in many countries. Intergenerational fairness is becoming a challenge in many countries where young people have limited access to resources and opportunities. At this stage, allow me to share a few representative findings that we observed in our work at the OECD Crete Center regarding the labour market participation rates of various population groups. Across the OECD area, in 2024, the populations of men and women in the working age, namely aged between 15 and 64, were approximately equal, with each group numbering about 450 million. However, 340 million men in the working age group are employed, and only 280 million women. The resulting employment rates are 75% for men and only 63% for women. In Belgium, the employment rate for women aged between 15 and 64 was 63.3%, while the employment rate for men in the same ages was 70.2%. In the OECD countries, in 2024, the population aged between 55 to 64 numbered 170 million, yet only 110 million were active in the labor market, resulting in an employment rate of 65%. In the report, it is stated that the employment rate of women aged between 20 and 64 in Belgium, of Belgian origin, is 75%, while that of the same age group is 61% for women of EU origin, and merely 47% for women of non-EU origin. Our project on migration as a lever to tackle labor market shortages in Mediterranean countries has already brought forward the fact that the gap in the employment rate between native-born and foreign-born women is almost 10 percentage points. It seems that being a migrant woman that is belonging at the same time to two underrepresented groups makes it very hard to secure a position in the labor market. The first Belgian diversity report sheds light on some of the reasons behind these observations, and I would like to underscore several findings within the report that reinforce our view and align with our observations. First, long-term labor market participation is particularly challenging for people with a lower secondary education or less. Individuals aged 55 and older, women, especially mothers and recent migrants. In particular, the employment rate in the 55 to 64 age group has increased significantly, but there is still plenty of room for improvement. Second, if someone aged 55 or over is not able to work at some point of their life, they very rarely find their way back into the labor market. This could be a significant reason that the employment rate of people aged between 55 to 64 is much lower than the general employment rate and can give intuition for the nature of the policy measures that could boost the employment of this age group. Third, the employment rate for individuals of non-EU origin continues to lag behind than the Belgian-born individuals. In addition, when they are employed, they are more likely to hold temporary or less secure contracts and earn lower wages. The potential impact of promoting diversity can be significant. OECD research has demonstrated that achieving higher old age participation and employment rates would partially compensate the estimated 8% drag of GDP per capita income, restraining to 3%. At the same time, the demographic projections imply that the workforce is going to be increasingly composed of fewer young people and more middle-aged adults in good health, who have the right to work, but who also can provide tangible results. In the 2020 OECD study on age inclusiveness in the workforce, promoting an age-inclusive workforce, using statistical data from a group of countries including Germany, Finland, Portugal, and Japan, it was estimated that individuals aged 50 and over exhibit productivity levels comparable to those aged between 35 to 49. Moreover, they are even more productive when a greater number of younger workers under the age of 35 is present. More specifically, the contribution of individuals over 50 to productivity growth can be doubled through the presence of younger employees. The results are straightforward. That we can see when the econometric models positively assess the value of age diversity, verifying our intuitive expectations. Why does this happen? Several potential channels through which diversity positively influences economic outcomes have been identified in the literature. As for example, in the OECD report, All Hands In, Making Diversity Works For, we observe teams with diverse backgrounds, experiences, and ideas tend to promote creativity and innovative thinking. Increased social cohesion enhances the level of interaction in the workplace, and disadvantaged groups tend to show more grit and determination. At this point, I would like to stress the fact that achieving diversity in the labor market requires a supportive institutional framework. In other words, we need to rethink our institutions in a way that diversity in the labor market is encouraged. For example, care for the elderly has traditionally relied on family caregivers, mainly women. Notably, in our recent publication on the fiscal implication of aging, it was stated that women account for more than 80% of workers in long-term care. In aging societies, long-term care needs are going to rise steeply. It will be harder for women to participate in the labor market if they simultaneously need to fulfill their role as a family member caregiver. Hence, moving forward, there is a growing need for professional, well-paid care workers. Of course, one can go on with several other examples that highlight the role of the institutional framework in bringing underrepresented groups to the labor market. Once again in history, education appears to be the key vehicle for achieving upward social mobility, acting as a catalyst to combat disparities. Look, for example, at the youth. Population aging is turning young people into a new minority group, which struggles to gain access to the labor market in a rapidly evolving technological environment that demands continuously updated skills. At the same time, the report highlights that individuals with at most lower secondary education who have experienced a period of incapacity to work face disadvantages when re-entering the labor market. In this context, governments should be increasingly called upon to modernize their educational systems and to promote effective lifelong learning schemes. A high-quality educational system which incorporates an effective upskilling and reskilling framework could provide individuals, especially young people, with opportunities to strengthen their skills and become more competitive in the labor market. This is the only way to ensure that young people can exercise their fundamental rights to work. Concluding, it is clear that the diversity lenses of the report facilitates the design of effective and targeted policies towards inclusive and sustainable growth in employment rates. Knowing where the labor market deficiencies are is the first step for taking action to fix them. Moreover, beyond the responsibility to promote inclusion based on fairness, excluding diverse groups from the labor market carries significant economic costs. Fully using the developing the skills and potential of disadvantaged groups would bring substantial benefits to the labor market and to society as a whole, particularly in the context of an aging population. The fact that based on the demographic projections, the biggest minority group will be the youth poses challenges to our democracies. Young people will be underrepresented in decision-making, while the older will be overrepresented. There is a need for a new intergenerational contract based on social justice. In this sense, the call to accommodate diversity in the labor markets is offering a window of opportunity that our democracies and economy should seize. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aris, for your comments and also for reassuring us that we in Belgium are not alone in all these challenges, that many countries are confronted with them, and which also means that we have an opportunity also to look for solutions together, to understand, to support each other. Well, the OECD and the Creed Center in particular are very important for this exchange on policies and experiences. From Athens back to Brussels, we will now get a perspective from the European Commission in particular on persons with disabilities. As was explained, this is one of the big challenges in our country. This was also an innovative part of the report this time. And for this, I will hand over to Monica Schaba from DG Employment. Monica, you have.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I've already tried to share my presentation. Can you confirm whether you can see it?
Yes.
Excellent, very good. So first of all, I wanted to thank you very much for inviting me to this extremely interesting event. I have to say I was listening to the presentations with great interest, and in particular with to the approach that you looked into persons with disabilities receiving the benefits, not receiving the benefits. This is a very, very interesting approach. I would definitely like to learn more about it. So just to give you a short introduction, I work in European Commission, Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, and indeed I deal with employment of persons with disabilities. So we're gonna make a focus. We're gonna zoom in to the very, very disadvantaged group in the labor market, persons with disabilities. And I will start my presentation now. Let me just change the slides. Can you just confirm whether the slides are changing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So at the level of the European Union, we have a very high prevalence of disability. So the level is around 100 million. The latest estimation show a slightly lower, lower level, about 90 million. However, what is important that within this group in the EU, we have 51 million of people with disabilities of working age. And then we have more, of course, those with a moderate and less with severe disabilities. However, this still amounts to the 1/5 of the whole EU working population. So almost 20% of the whole EU working population are persons with disabilities. However, when we look into the labor market outcomes, we realize that around 50% of persons with disabilities are in employment. The latest data, these are the data from 2023, 0.254%. So we see a slight increase. The outcomes of women, we've heard it a lot today, are lower, but even lower are the outcomes for young persons with disabilities. So they are the most disadvantaged at the labor market. And then, of course, persons with severe disabilities are most disadvantaged. About 30% of them are in employment. We've talked about inactivity rate. This is again disadvantaged outcome. About 40% of persons with disabilities are inactive in the EU, and this means that they are outside of the statistics. They're not registered with employment services. At the left side, you see the graph. This is an indicator that we measure at the EU level. This is the disability employment gap, which looks into the gap in employment between persons with and without disabilities. You can see this line is almost flat, and currently it stands at 24 percentage points, is measured in percentage points. I wanted to show you where Belgium stands. So the disability employment gap in Belgium has been overall over the years quite high, one of the highest amongst the EU member states, as you can see, although we haven't really seen, we've seen a slight decrease last year. Now, what has an impact, as has been said today, are the other factors that we have to look, we have to zoom into to have a better view, and this is the severe disability. So at the left side you see that the overall disability employment gap, and at the right side you see the disability employment gap for those with severe disabilities. And in the first graph we talk about 20 percentage points range, whereas in the second graph we talk about 40 percentage points ranges. Now, also what we see at the EU level, and we've also touched upon it today, is the type of a disability. So you see that certain disabilities have a higher impact on employment. So does the number of the health conditions. You see it at the right side, that people with the most health conditions have the lowest labor market outcomes compared to those with the less number of health conditions. Also, what we've seen today is the employment by economic sector. We know that persons with disabilities are overrepresented in certain sectors and underrepresented in the others. The ones where they are not well represented, and they could be in the context of the digital transformation, is, for example, information and communication. We see there not a lot work there. Also financial and insurance activities. These are the sectors where relatively with the right training and support we could achieve some improvement. And then in occupations, they are underrepresented in managers, professional, technicians roles, and overrepresented in elementary occupations. So this is the EU level. Now, the quality employment is rare. Here, the rate is slightly different. What I heard was presented for Belgium is that about 50% of persons with disabilities work full-time, if I understood correctly. At the EU level, it's even less. It's about 30% who work full-time. And then if we have the questionnaires asking persons with disabilities if they would like to work full-time, majority of them say they would. And as I've mentioned already, young persons with disabilities are most disadvantaged, not only because it's very difficult for them to enter the labor market, but when they do enter the labor market, that they very often work under temporary contracts. One of the major issues here is so-called sheltered employment, where conditions differ, and in some regions, not even member states, but in some cities, the conditions would be quite good and the employment would be of high qualities, where there in others the quality of employment would be low. The persons with disabilities would not be covered by labor law, and the wages would be really minimum. Now, I wanted to also show you what we monitor, because we talked today about monitoring. So we do such monitoring at the EU level. And here we use the Eurostat. Eurostat introduced a special tab on disability where you can find a lot of information on prevalence, poverty, social protection, labor market education, etc., etc. But we also use, and this is something which would ensure longer comparability. This is the European Disability Expertise, which is the contractor of the European Commission. This contractor provides a lot of reports. You see them on the right side on employment. For example, you would have employment report, quite recent, on every single member state. You see here the report on Belgium. You would find reports on social protection, different themes. And as I've mentioned, European disability expertise provides us with the information for a very, very long period of time. These are the EU Silk based analysis, whereas Eurostat is based on LFS. Now, how do we use this data? We use them, of course, in the European semester, which is our main economic policy framework for comparison of the member states. And here you can see we look in different aspects of diversity. So we look into the gender employment gap, we look into equal opportunities, and then we look into the disability employment gap. I've mentioned this indicator earlier on, where we use different colors to show our performance. So you would see the best performance, the average, and the critical situation or the situation to watch. We use it in the European semester, in the country reports. So we basically provide an analysis, and on this analysis provide some policy pointers, recommendations to the member states. Now, I wanted to mention very briefly the broader policy framework, the broader EU policy framework. So we have our main policy framework it goes even beyond the European Union, is the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where not only individual member states are parties, but also the European Union is the party, and the convention covers all areas of lives. But we also have a very strong legal instrument. This is the Employment Equality Directive from the year 2000, which forbids discrimination in employment on a number of reasons, including disabilities, and which it obliges employers to provide reasonable accommodation in employment as long as it does not constitute disproportional burden. Now, on the national level, what we see is that a lot of measures have been implemented to support employment of persons with disabilities. So the most popular, of course, is quotas. This exists in most of the member states, in public, in private sector. There are subsidies, not only wage subsidies, but also subsidies for the provision of reasonable accommodation. There are a lot of awareness raising campaigns and support for businesses. But in spite of all this, the attitude towards persons with disabilities has not changed. And this is my personal viewpoint, that even though we have these very strong policy frameworks and also financial support, we still see that the attitudes of employers, of persons with disabilities haven't really changed. And in my view, they constitute the major barrier for inclusion of persons with disabilities. And this is mainly lack of awareness about the potential of persons with disabilities, about support that is available for employment of persons with disabilities. And on the side of persons with disabilities, this is low self-awareness, and because of that, very often non-disclosure or non-fighting for the rights. And then this also have a result and a broader institutional context when we don't really see coordinated support for persons with disabilities and cooperation between different actors that are involved in different policies or measures for persons with disabilities. So this all made us think how we could support employment of persons with disabilities through the strategy for the rights of persons with disabilities. This is the strategy we put for the years 2021-2030, and we within the strategy focus on all areas of lives of persons with disabilities, but we were thinking what we could do in the area of employment that wouldn't be a repetition of what's done already, but that could help to emphasize or strengthen the existing policy framework. And for that, we decided to come up with disability employment package. Now, so disability employment package is a set of guidance that we thought are very much needed to increase awareness of employers, of persons with disabilities, of all the stakeholders that are involved in support of persons with disabilities. And those guidelines cover all stages of employment you can see on screen, from recruitment, through career guidance, through retention in employment of persons with disabilities, return to work, including vocational rehabilitation, and we also focused on alternative employment models. Now, this guidance explain the legal and policy frameworks, the EU level, but also the national ones. They also provide information about what support is available to employers. They explain the obligation of employers as well as the roles and responsibilities. All the guidelines are written in a very instructional way. So what should we do, when and how, who is responsible at different stage of employment. They provide a lot of practices, and I wanted to show you some numbers. So we have 6 guidelines all together. They are all published. So if you Google disability employment package, you will be able to find them and download them. We have one study, I've mentioned it, on alternative employment models. This is the very informative study which tries to define what is alternative employment, meaning employment outside of the labor market, of the open labor market, which is still the most popular, the most present model of employing of persons with disabilities, how we can categorize different models. We have a lot of checklists in the package. We have a number of methods described. We have description of the roles, description of responsibilities, different links and resources. I am not going to give you all the numbers, but you can see on the screen it's a wealth of models and examples that I very strongly encourage you to use. And here I provide the code so you can make a photo. I am very happy to get involved in any discussions, to take any of the questions, and I will definitely reach out to you to discuss further your excellent study. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Monica, for explaining to us how the European Union tackles the issue of disability and the labor market. So with that, I will now open the floor to all of you for any questions you may want to ask to the presenters. You can raise your virtual hand. You can also put the question in the chat of the meeting or the Q&A section. So please. Monica, you have a question.
Yeah, I can be the icebreaker. I think you always need an icebreaker, but I truly have a question. So as I said, I'm very much impressed with the report, and I wanted to ask you, Anne, that maybe you can explain a little bit more your approach towards how you calculated the number of persons with disabilities, those receiving the benefits, those not receiving the benefits. You used administrative data, how difficult or easy it was. If you can give a little bit more insight, it would be great.
So it's quite complex because there are a number of government institutions involved, but the information is integrated with the other data from the data warehouse, labor market and social protection. And we actually know when people have applied for recognition. And we know what score has been given to them. So they get there are, I think, they can have a total of 7 points depending on the level of disability. So in this way, we can see whether they are recognized, first of all, and if they are recognized, if they can also receive a benefit on that basis, which also depends on their situation, other types of income, etc. So it is quite fine-grained data. Of course, there are problems, such as with all administrative data. There can be delay in the decision. People who have applied but have not been processed yet. It also depends sometimes on whether they are still living at home or not. So it's quite complex, and we will probably be working on this further for the next edition to see if we can make improvement based on what we learned now, and what should be left out, or what we could maybe add from other sources. Because even when people do not have a general recognition, we might find them in other sources because they, for example, get a parking card. So based on some kind of disability, they could get access to closer parking spots, things like that. So these are other types of sources that are not linked to income related benefits, but that also give us some indication on whether or not someone has some kind of a limitation.
Thank you. Yeah, I learned yesterday that also the data on the European Disability Card will be integrated in the data warehouse, so that's another source.
Yeah, and I can maybe respond to the question in the chat, which is whether we will receive the presentations. I actually still need to ask the presenters who had slide if I can indeed share the presentations afterwards. But if I get their agreement, then we will share the presentations.
Thank you for that information. Any more questions, comments? Everything was.
Can I have another question?
Of course you can.
As I said, it's extremely interesting webinar for me. So it's a great report, probably very difficult to read, as you've mentioned, 400 pages and a lot of annexes. But how do you intend to use the results? I mean, what are the next steps? Who will you discuss it with?
Yeah, maybe I can say something about that. So first of all, this is the English version of the report. The Dutch and French versions have been published much earlier already, and so well, the reports have been presented in another seminar to two policymakers, to those social partners. We also sent these reports to them. What we also do is that for the social partners, for each so-called joint committee, so sectoral bipartite committees of the social partners, we provide them with a specific fiche on their own sector. With all the data on all the different aspects of diversity in their sector, and which serves for them as a basis for discussion. So they have been invited also to send us a report, analyzing the situation, looking at what they can learn from it. Some of them giving us also suggestions on how we can even further improve the analysis. So we do encourage the social partners to discuss. We use it also, of course, as suggestions, as an input to the research community. We use it as a way to improve the data in the data warehouse. We have learned that other researchers are now planning to use, for instance, the same variables that we created on disability. So this. Yeah, we try to use it as an input into the policy debate, but also to encourage further analysis. In the chat, I see a question for Julie. The question is whether your research has been published in a paper. Maybe Julie, you can reply to that yourself.
Hi, we didn't publish a paper on it, but we have a very elaborate report on it. It's in Dutch, but we have a French and an English summary. So for now, there is no English version of these results, but Anne wants to hop on, I think.
Yes, just a small addition that we are also translating the entire report to French, so that we at least have the full version in Dutch and in French. And as Julie said, there is a shorter English version. And when we have finished the French version, they will also be accessible on the website of our ministry. So we don't have a link yet. But it will be there in, well, shortly.
The link will be there once we have both the Dutch and the French version, federal institutions and so on. So you have to be a little patient. Other questions or comments? I don't see further hands and nothing in the chat, so everything was crystal clear and you agree with all the conclusions that everybody has presented, which is nice to hear. So I think this means that, okay, we are approaching the end of the seminar. So let me try a bit to bring together what we've heard today with the policy recommendations in our report. I think there are two key messages that are important for us to reach the employment rate of 80%. That was already referred to. This is our national target. Well, and also to solve labor market mismatches, we need a more diverse labor market, and this greater diversity in the labor market will not result from a single policy lever. I think that is clear for everyone. This requires a broad, coordinated and sustained approach. And like I said before, fortunately, we're not alone in this. We can learn a lot from what other countries have done. So what our report shows, and as also Aris has explained, diversity is not a side issue of labor market policy. It's at the heart of how our labor markets function, how resilient they are, and how fair their outcomes can be. So yeah, so this coordinated approach, no silos. Why? Well, employment gaps between groups are persistent, but they're also clearly interlinked. This is it's not new, but if you look at the results that Julie presented, it comes out very clearly. Gaps have to do with education, with origin, with gender, with age, with health status, with household situation, and probably also with many factors that we haven't discovered yet, or that we simply cannot map on the basis of administrative data. And these differences, they do not disappear simply because overall employment improves. We have seen a very good evolution of our labor market recently. However, this doesn't solve everything. Broadly speaking, it helps everyone, but it doesn't solve all the issues. On the contrary, we can still improve overall employment if we indeed embrace diversity further. So this means education policy, employment services, social protection, migration policy, housing policies, transport policies, and integration policies. They all have to interact in one way or another, and a coordinated approach between levels of government and between governments and social partners would be, well, it's not just a nice to have. In fact, it's a precondition almost. But it goes without saying that is a particular challenge in everywhere, but also in particular in Belgium and with our institutions. So to echo what Aris already said, education and skills are necessary, but they are not sufficient. Education remains one of the strongest predictors of employment outcomes. That's quite clear. That has not changed, and initiatives like the recent Commission recommendation on human capital, well, the recommendation for a recommendation, I should say, they are therefore very welcome. But today's discussion also reminds us of a more uncomfortable truth. Improving education levels alone will not close employment gaps. Better qualifications for some groups do not translate immediately into employment in the same to the same extent as others. So we also must go beyond this educational attainment and focus on, well, for instance, how skills are recognized, how they are valued, how they are rewarded in the labor market. And in our country in particular, better recognition of qualifications, including those that have been obtained abroad, is quite important in that respect. And also along the same lines, lifelong learning, which is essential. It cannot just be treated as an individual responsibility alone. It requires incentives, financing, time, clear signals from employers and social partners that learning actually leads somewhere. Supporting unemployed and inactive people means that we need to address their full situation. They are rarely caused by a single factor. For many people, barriers to work are not only about skills, about motivation. They can be about housing that's too far from their job, transport that is unavailable, that is too expensive. In these days of railroad strikes in Belgium, this may ring a bell. Family responsibilities and the availability of care also, health issues, weak integration into local networks, but also attitudes, convictions. This all plays a role. So this means that effective activation policies must also look beyond the labor market itself, and maybe the reform of the unemployment benefit system that entered into force in Belgium on the 1st of January this year could help to foster such a more integrated look. Of course, incentives and labor costs matter. Nobody should have to explain this in Belgium, but quality matters too. Incentives are part of a broader picture. It's essential to make work pay. It's clear that inactivity traps, poorly aligned incentives, they discourage participation. That's all very necessary, but we should also underline something else. People do not only respond to fit financial incentives, they also respond to job quality and prospects. And indeed, like I already said, and like Monica underlined, to attitudes. So greater diversity requires that there is a sufficient range of job opportunities, that there is attention to working conditions, to adapting workplaces if needed, that there are opportunities for progression, and that are credible career perspectives. Mobility within the labor market is important, and it's a weak point of our country, that's well known. Diversity also depends on how easily it is to move within the labor market, to move between sectors, between regions, between employment status, between employment also in the open labor market and more protected jobs in some cases, and also back into work after periods of unemployment, sickness, or care, which is for sure a domain where we still have quite a lot of work to do. When mobility is weak, in a way, disadvantages accumulate. When mobility is supported, then diversity can really become a source of resilience rather than segmentation. So we need to think about portable rights, transferable skills, supporting transitions rather than penalizing them. Of course, when we discuss diversity, we cannot avoid also discussing discrimination. One thing I think which I would like to underline is that we often look at discrimination at a hiring stage. For many reasons, this is easy this is relatively easy to measure, to see. However, it's also quite obvious in some cases. However, we shouldn't forget that discrimination can also occur in access to training, in task allocation, in promotions, in contract renewals. So if we focus only on recruitment, we miss a large part of the problem. Let's be clear, that's not just a moral statement. It's also about ensuring that talent is not wasted in our economies. And then finally, looking at migration policies, I think today's discussion also confirms that migration policies and labor market policies, they cannot be separated. If we look at origin data, this comes out quite clearly. And if migration is only treated as a short-term response to labor shortages, which can be important, this is to be underlined, but we also risk creating long-term segmentation and underutilization of skills. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. So to conclude a bit with a broader reflection, demographic change, diversity, and technological transformation, that's not separate challenges. They interact and they reinforce each other. If we respond with fragmented policies, we will also get fragmented labor outcomes, and we should try to work towards a coherent, preventive, and inclusive strategy, and to make diversity a strength rather than a risk. So that is what I would conclude from today. I don't know if Iris or Monica would like to add something to that before I really close. No, I don't see any requests to add to what I've said. So let me then end with some publicity. We organize another webinar next Monday, in which we will look at the Belgian system of temporary unemployment, tijdelijke werkloosheid, chômage temporaire, during which the OECD and also our National Employment Office, RVA, ONM, they will each present a report on this. So you can find the information on this webinar on our website, but it's also now in the chat. And then on the 25th of February in Paris, we will co-organize with our social inspection and information service, the CIOCIRS, with DG Employment, with the OECD, and with the European Labour Authority, a seminar on data about posted third country nationals. So posting is a well-known phenomenon in the European Union, where workers from one country are temporarily sent to another country. And what we see nowadays is more and more that those workers that are posted are not just the nationals from within the EU, but also people from outside the European Union. There's still a lack of data on this, and we will bring many stakeholders together to discuss how we can improve this data and get a better picture of this also politically important phenomenon. And our registration for this will open probably later this week. So keep following the websites of the organizations that I have mentioned. And so finally, let me then end by sincerely thanking all speakers for their contributions, by also thanking all my colleagues that have contributed to our report, of course, not only to this English version, but already to the Dutch and the French version as well, and to all the sector fiches that we have made. And let me thank all of you for your participation and your interest, and wish you a nice continuation of the day. Thanks a lot.